Hunt Showdown is, in my opinion, one of the greatest PvP first-person shooters ever made. While it definitely has its flaws, and certainly isn't for everyone, since I began playing it roughly a year ago, I've come to enjoy it far more than any standard arcade shooter. And this isn't just because of the shooting part. See, Hunt Showdown takes place many years ago, right around the end of the Gilded Age, in a world where the paranormal has become natural, and humans from all around the world have risen up to hunt every last monster down. It's these monsters that we'll be looking at in this biological analysis of Hunt Showdown. The world of Hunt Showdown is a complex one. While the gameplay loop is relatively simple, being an objective-based extraction shooter, the happenings of the world are well documented and have a history that runs deep. Now, to understand the present events and ultimately the life forms of Hunt Showdown, we must first understand the occurrence known as the Louisiana event. When we think of the paranormal, usually we'd think of isolated, claustrophobic cases of ghost hauntings and possessions. However, in Hunt Showdown, the paranormal has become epidemic. The source of this epidemic remains for the most part unknown. Whispers go around about a malady that washed over Louisiana, others speak of practitioners of voodoo who curse the land, and others still claim a greater being beyond human perception is behind it all. For the sake of simplicity, we'll call the culmination of all these ideas the corruption. The corruption is a force that takes over the minds of innocent and not so innocent humans and, well, corrupts them. It sculpts them into many monstrous forms, some familiar, but others completely abominable. This corruption, though, is not just a force that may reanimate the dead or sculpt abominations from nothing. No, its purpose seems to be to do nothing less than torture all of its victims. It is often cited that those who have been taken over by the corruption have been left conscious, aware of all that occurs around them. With this information, we will come to see that the corruption of Hunt Showdown could be seen as one of the most evil maladies that could ever have touched the various landscapes afflicted. In addition to all this, there is also the force that is the sculptor, which is apparently what causes all of these units to look the same every time, but it doesn't really have that big of an influence on the actual biology of the monsters we'll be looking at today, so I will be passing on actually talking about it right now and be saving it for the end of the video. And so, with all this in mind, we move on to the first unit to be analyzed, the Hellhound. The Hellhounds, named this due to their unmatched aggressive temperament with some ancient mythological roots, are pack hunters that have adapted to work together with each other to hunt prey down. The main source of information for these things are an assortment of researcher journal entries and newspaper clippings. Not exactly the most verifiable information, but most of it can be verified based on what we see in the world. The first of these is from an unnamed researcher's journal, which casts doubt onto the validity of the claims that would say the Hellhounds were undead or possessed dogs. Clearly, this researcher has never seen one in person, as if they had, they would have known that in the state that the Hellhound is in, it should not in any way, shape, or form be able to move with the strength and athleticism that it does. The Hellhound's body is very clearly missing essential tissue, mostly that of the face and the torso and, the insides, the internal organs. According to named researcher Tamrat Scognamiglio, there are suspicions that previously this maimed dog was an Italian Mastiff. Although this obviously cannot be 100% confirmed, there are a few similarities, and we can at the very least tell that the Hellhound was definitely a domesticated breed of dog before this happened to it. Also, for some reason, the researchers involved continuously mention rabies, as if it could somehow reanimate an animal's corpse, which, to the extent of my knowledge on rabies, isn't really possible. Hellhound packs usually come in sizes of 2 to 5, but even 1 is enough to run a standard human down. Due to their paranormal nature, it is likely that they don't need to eat, only attacking due to the malice of the corruption. However, if they did need to eat, it is likely that they would prey on local prey animals like cottontails or minks, mammals known to be local to Louisiana. It really could be any prey, but those are just approximations based on the location. We also see that around most hellhounds, there is a big metal chain around their neck. This could mean any number of things, but I like to think it means that they were in some way weaponized by people who may have wanted to utilize them for their own benefit. Judging by the fact that they run free in the wild, this clearly did not go well. In the documentation for the Hellhound, there is a story of a dog named Bunny that seemingly hints towards the initial creation of the Hellhound in the first place. However, it seems that it's some kind of analogy or something, so I'll put it on screen for you guys to read it. Overall, the Hellhounds are amongst the most basic of the monsters that the corruption has produced. At a distance, it could easily be mistaken for a generic rabid dog. No doubt many innocent souls have been lost to this mistake. The same can be said for the next individual in the roster, the Grunt. The Grunt is by far the most common monster ever produced by the corruption. However, due to their human nature, they are also the most uncanny. Our main source of information when it comes to these things is a series of journals by a Dr. Raynard Winkler. This individual seems to have taken an interest in studying that which was being produced by the corruption during his time, namely, the Grunts. This typewritten journal details his observations regarding the Grunts. As we would expect from most zombies, they appear to be humans that are in the middle of the decomposition process, missing essential parts of their body, and yet it has the ability to freely walk around. Notably, these decomposing monstrosities are constantly surrounded by flies. This is tied to a surprising revelation about how the zombies of this universe actually work. You see, whenever this thing was infected, its heart underwent some kind of a mutation, no longer appearing like a traditional organ, but like some kind of spherical, pulsating orb. It is found that this imitation of the heart is actually something of a nest. Yes, it seems that the physical explanation for this corpse's possession is that it's somehow been hijacked by some kind of huge network of larvae that, as one could assume, eventually hatch into flies of some kind and begin to fly around the host. While this infection is most definitely in the realm of some kind of magic, it's quite interesting how it has this kind of explanation. If I were to make an overall guess as to how this works, I would say that upon infection, larvae eat through the heart and shape it into a new spherical form, and would begin to reproduce and produce the thick black liquid that runs through their veins. But of course, this liquid doesn't come from nowhere, as it seemingly is needed for the nutrition of the larvae being held within it. We can assume that in the early days of being infected, this black liquid may come from whatever food the host has previously consumed. However, after somehow losing control over their body, they will no longer be able to find nutrition in such civil ways, instead opting to violently consume whatever organic matter they can find in order to sustain the lives of the larvae contained within them. This creates some form of life cycle where the human involved is like a host to create, nurture, and release larvae as full-grown flies until it is no longer suitable. Now, you may have noticed that in the process, the brain was pretty much left untouched. We can obviously infer that the nervous system has in some way been altered, since you kind of need it to move, and the grunts have been seen to have such precision that they can hold tools and weapons, and even a pistol in their hands with decent finger dexterity. As a result of this fact, there is a very grim possibility that the host has kept its consciousness, being forced to watch itself act in ways savage and monstrous, unable to do anything about it. Truly, it can be said that anytime a hunter puts one of these things down, a great mercy has been enacted. Overall, the grunts are infected humans that we see come from all backgrounds of life. Many were town inhabitants, many were essential workers, some may have even been past hunters, all repurposed to the basic fighting force of the corruption. However, some were positioned at more critical areas and thus needed greater defenses. In this case, some humans were repurposed to become the Armoreds. The Armored Grunt, otherwise known as simply the Armored, is a grunt that has undergone a process foreign to what caused it to be a grunt in the first place. Based on the text provided, it seems like there's a clear story as to how they became this way. There are newspaper clippings included in the text that clearly show an important sequence of events. A local miner drinks a newly found liquid that came from a crystal geode. He suddenly dies and is petrified. After that, a poor man catches fire and dies, and two men seemingly involved with the petrification of the miner came into possession of his body and claimed to have preserved his body through a new method of artificial petrification. It seems that this caught great wind in and around New Orleans and Louisiana, so much so that it became a semi-common practice. At this point, you may be asking what this has to do with anything, and to that I reply what the side effects of the artificial petrification process were. And I quote, "After 2 weeks, there was no trace of decomposition, and the flesh began to harden. Strange growths, resembling that of papery wasp nest, still puzzle the men, who declare that not long more is needed to perfect the fluid." And that definitely sounds familiar. It is clear that the Armored are grunts that before their reanimation were preserved with this method. After reanimating, they got up slow but durable, and that durability only grew stronger as the weeks passed and the growths appeared. The Armored that we see in-game are always in the late stages of the petrification, having wasp nest-like material covering their whole body, with only a part of their arm being exposed, allowing a new arm grown by the corruption itself, having sharp claws to easily shred through flesh. While the material appears to be paper-thin, do not be fooled, as according to tests conducted by the researchers, smaller calibers of bullets can be completely stopped by it, and longer calibers still stalled. Even with this great ability, the paper-like material still acts like paper, being extremely susceptible to flames and easily cut and punctured by sharp edges. By far what this armor defends against the most is blunt force impact, as blunt weapons will be especially ineffective. The Armored is one of the most dangerous units in Hunt Showdown. While they can easily be destroyed, they can just as easily tear through any hunter who is unprepared. The same applies to our next unit, but this one applies the idea in a completely different format. For documentation on the Immolator, we actually have a story of what seems to be the first documented appearance of one. The first 3 documents are burnt, undated papers written by a Father Vincent Clemens. These were part of a private journal that he kept as a confessional priest. He tells of a boy who came to confession who confessed to his involvement with a gang of thieves, one that, at the time, tied up and beat up a preacher, Reverend Jeremiah, for testifying against them. This boy witnessed the gang members kidnapping and beating the priest to near death. However, an almost supernatural occurrence came to happen that day. As the boy describes, he began to scream, and he kept right on screaming, and there was just a light like fire, and he began to burn. Didn't see anyone light a match, and that was the end of the boy's description. We get greater insight with what apparently seems to be a dime novel, which were cheaply sold stories, often sold in the United States during the time period, written about Reverend Jeremiah himself. This story tries to paint a picture about Jeremiah's perspective, painting him as a righteous man who had nothing but himself to lose, and thus he began to campaign against a gang known as the Black Hand. Now, we actually know a good bit about the Black Hand in the Hunt lore, as they were somewhat of a notorious gang of bandits, but what's most interesting is a rival shotgun skin that is actually titled the Black Hand. However, it's actually said to have been owned by Reverend Jeremiah himself, only being stolen and having been customized and engraved in the way it was later. So, when Jeremiah was taken from his home and out to the bayou, the dime novel claims that the gang offered to spare him if he kept his mouth shut. However, the dear Reverend retaliated, saying, "Whenever I speak, I cry out and I proclaim the violence and destruction," shouting at this point. The bandits stepped back a bit, as it was claimed that what is described as an unholy light began to come from his face. Obviously, the thugs were just extremely confused at this point, but Jeremiah went on, saying, "Let him that stop me be destroyed, like the cities of old that the Lord overthrew without mercy." As soon as he said that, the novel claims he burst into flames, completely consumed by the so-called heavenly fire. Running at the men, he sank his teeth into their flesh, ripping them apart, and that was that. The novel ends there. So, what can we make of this? Well, if we assume that all the information given here was accurate, which, don't get me wrong, it could definitely be sensationalism coming from a dime novel, but assuming it wasn't, we could make the claim that the Immolator comes into existence by some form of great conviction or determination when near death. It would seem that this has nothing at all to do with the infection that the Grunts and Armored have gone through. In fact, I believe this is the first truly 100% spiritual being that can be observed within the ranks of the monsters that prowl the bayou of Hunt Showdown. Let's lay all the hard facts we have about the general race of Immolators out now. The second they hear a slight noise from a hunter or otherwise a sentient human being, it will run at a blistering pace, one that no natural human could outrun. They use this same speed for quicker paced attacks, slashing with their hands, and causing anything they touch to smolder. This is pretty much how they are for 90% of the time. However, on the off chance that something like a bullet or knife pierce their skin, suddenly they'll burst into a raging flame, running even faster now and leaving a trail of fire in their wake. In this state, the Immolator can in no way be staggered, being fully focused on its prey. Fire that comes from their trail can ignite explosive barrels, which can sometimes be an advantage on the battlefield. In fact, I would even call the Immolator the most useful distraction when it comes to the natural resources used for combat in the bayou. It can, however, be quite easily combated. An Immolator, under normal conditions, can be killed relatively easily if you have a blunt weapon or a gun stock to hit it with. This is the main foil to the Immolator, which is somewhat ironic considering the circumstances that Reverend Jeremiah was in. However, beating the literal hell out of it isn't the only way to kill it, as you can also extinguish its fire using choke bombs, and even water bottles laying around the place. If you happen to be engaged in a fight with an ignited Immolator, the safest way to kill it is to submerge it at knee height in water. The best way to achieve this goal is to bait it into a small lake by jumping in yourself, as it will mindlessly follow you. Apparently though, they aren't as mindless as one would think, as for some reason, the Immolators actually have the ability to open doors. Whether they just push them open or they actually interact with them to open them, I do not know, but they are the only monster that, as far as I've seen, possesses this ability, which alone is a notable occurrence. Above all, one should remember to never underestimate this thing, because once you've gotten into the flow of killing them, it's easy to forget just how dangerous they can really be. Overall, the Immolator is surely one of the most horrifying monsters in all of Hunt Showdown. If not for its appearance, then definitely for the fear that its howl strikes into the heart of any hunter. However, the title of the absolute most horrifying goes not to the Immolator, but to our next monster, the Hive. Now, to expand on that statement about the Hive being the most horrifying monster, the dossier on the Hive opens with the following. Of the 10 creatures I have researched thus far, it is the Hive who haunts my dreams. This was a statement by an unnamed researcher, presumably in the future, looking into the story of Ada Ruth Schell. She was one daughter of 7, all under the care of a single mother, whose 8th child had died and husband went soon after. Their living conditions were extremely poor. Ada claims they all slept in a single room in a small house without any kind of central air conditioning and, by the description of a leaky roof, many perforations. That is all to say that their living conditions were exceptionally unsanitary, which is important to note, as what comes next, I believe, was the result of this. See, it was Ada's 13th birthday, a day which wasn't exactly celebrated due to their poor conditions. Ada's mom in particular was in a pretty bad state. To make matters worse, the day was saturated with mosquitoes and flies and airborne insects of all kinds. The day was pretty bad, but it was about to get much worse as her mom suddenly became very still, only chewing on her finger, one of her nervous habits, but this was quite different. Her mom just sat there. As she did, the parade of insects grew and grew and grew, reaching proportions that Ada described as biblical, like the locust plague upon Egypt. The bugs were so numerous she could not even breathe without some flies entering her mouth. As all this was happening, the insects began to crawl inside the mother's orifices on her face, first her mouth, then her ears. All the while, the mom just sat there. The buzzing kept getting louder and louder. The bugs kept coming in through the open windows, and the mother just simply stood there as her children began to panic and scream. The tension kept on building until Ada heard a huge snapping noise while her eyes were closed. Upon opening her eyes, she met a horrid sight. Her mother's torso burst open, and in the center, a bug hive housing what must have felt like millions of bugs at that point. To a 13-year-old child, this was obviously a scarring sight, and the same can definitely be said about the rest of her other 6 siblings, who all promptly ran from the house with her. Tragically, only 5 survived, as 2 did not live through the hail of insects. The other 5, including Ada, were admitted to a mental ward where we get one of the most important pieces of information for the Hive thus far. At the asylum, they found out that Ada was somehow pregnant. At the age of 13, this was clearly unusual, and Ada had never had relations with anyone, so of course the doctors cut the quote-unquote baby out of her, only to find that there was no baby, but a strange, hard and dead piece of what appeared to be chewed up wood. And with that, we clearly see the cause of the creation of the Hive. Ultimately, Ada Ruth Schell went on to be initiated into the AHA, American Hunters Association, as a hunter, and from there she forged her own path. However, she was just this close to ending up exactly like her mother. Based on this, the following is my best estimate on how the Hive is created. When a female sex hunter travels throughout the bayou, it may be possible that they encounter certain unusual swarms of bugs. During these swarms, it is very possible that they become so numerous that some enter the mouth and overall sinuses. I believe these bugs are for some reason designed to survive human anatomy and make their way into the uterus, utilizing it to house a specialized nest with the help of nutrients from the body. Following this, that hive grows so much until it bursts, and from there, it will work as any old wasp nest, with insects being born and grown within the hive and bugs being sent out to attack any potential predators that may disrupt it. Similarly to the grunt, and due to the nature of the nutrients being needed to sustain the hive, it is very possible that the host, tragically, remains conscious during this process, even letting out a high-pitched scream whenever other human beings get near it, possibly a cry for help from the suffering being caused by these parasites. The overall unit itself operates in a very simple way, simply remaining for the most part stationary, only moving very minimally, likely to conserve energy. Whenever a threat comes near, a swarm of an assortment of insects will be sent out to sting and ultimately kill it with what may even be a variety of different kinds of venom. This venom is potent enough to kill a hunter should it be allowed to linger. However, it can quite easily be thwarted, either by swatting them away with a melee weapon or attack, or by killing the host itself. Interestingly, it seems that once they no longer have a hive to return to, the insects will simply disperse, possibly to locate another host to impregnate in the future. This swarm of insects is so potent that weapon engineers were somehow able to sample a swarm of these things and contain them in a jar. While they disperse quickly without a host, they will still remain in formation for a time long enough to be weaponized against anyone who needs to be flushed out of cover. Overall, the Hive is definitely the most bizarre and horrifying monster seen throughout the bayou, whose design even partially inspired me to make this video in the first place, as it was one of the first dreaded things that I encountered, and the same can be said for our next unit, the Meathead. The Meathead is the bayou's very own hulking brute, guarding areas of particular importance when rifts are involved. The documentation on this thing comes in the form of a journal entry written by initials WS, thought to be William Salter. Dated as the summer of 1895, this journal mentions a letter regarding an individual named Hannah Kinney, written by the AHA. Addressed to the members of the association, this letter detailed her death. You see, the American Hunters Association for a long time did not allow women amongst their ranks, which you would expect considering that it was the 1800s and like half the population of America was sexist anyway. However, the AHA's reasoning wasn't exactly like that, as when they were first founded, they actually were positive to having women initiates, having 3 female initiates at the time of their founding. However, it was quickly found out that to be a woman in the AHA was a lot more dangerous than one would think. See, hunters, in order to hunt and kill efficiently, pump themselves with countless different substances, both scientifically and spiritually unstable, and as initiates, they also inject a kind of serum into themselves. The Hunters of the Association are known for possession of supernatural abilities, often tied to dark magic of sorts, so you can imagine when one of the first female initiates became pregnant and suddenly became extremely powerful, it was definitely the cause for concern when it was time for her term to end. As expected, she did not survive the pregnancy, and the fetus that was born from her was powerful to such a degree that, even in a fetal state, it single-handedly tore through 12 hunters before being put down. It was after this that female initiates were no longer allowed for a time, but eventually they were once again soft permitted, which brings us back to what happened to Mrs. Kinney. See, her husband was a part of the AHA and really bad at keeping secrets, so he told her and she wanted in. So they both initiated into the AHA, and she was the first female hunter to be initiated in a long time, decades even. She even hid herself from the hunters, dressing to obscure her appearance so she could hunt alongside her dear husband, and that they did, becoming a renowned duo of hunters that, at the time, and I quote, rid us of more terrible creatures than most of us will destroy in a lifetime. But that came with a huge trade-off. It was around this point that Mrs. Kinney began exhibiting great powers, single-handedly taking down entities of great power, which was, once again, cause for concern, as that is one of the symptoms of the cursed pregnancy from before. She was pregnant, and eventually the time came for her to give birth, and well, I'll just read out this description by a Dr. Henry of the AHA of what happened on that day. Her eyes glowed and her skin steamed. A grin appeared frozen upon her face, though her moans and screams spoke only of pain. Even as the creature clawed its way from her body, disgorging leeches and disemboweling the mother, devouring her flesh as it did, she laughed. She laughed. Long after her pulse had stopped, she laughed. I shall never forget that sound as long as I live. We should have burned the body. We should have burned the entire building to the ground. That thing that emerged from her body was a child, the size of about a 7-year-old, lacking a head and covered in leeches. The doctor ran to get help, but by the time he was back, the kid and the mother's corpse were long gone. Today, the hunter initiation process has been updated as a result of this with an injection potent enough to prevent conception. And to this day, female hunters stand safely among the ranks of the AHA, or at least as safe as any hunter could be anyway. So, with that, we now know a Meathead might come into existence, being the child of a pregnant hunter who gave birth to a powerful abomination. The Meatheads themselves are something of a symbiotic unit, as the label Meathead is to describe the combination of the main human-like entity and the leeches that it commands. See, the body itself obviously has no head, so it's completely blind and deaf and can't smell. However, it can sense and will attack anything that its leeches attack. Essentially, the leeches are its eyes, except it's through touch rather than actual sight. This is the explanation as to why its body is surrounded in them, as the Meathead also has the ability to sense hunters who get too close to the point of barely touching it. Once it has sensed a hunter, it will chase with a surprising amount of speed for its size, surprising most of the newly initiated. Overall, one may think the Meathead to be the biggest and baddest of all the monsters amongst the corruption. However, this role has been given to none other than the Brute. The Brute is the toughest monster in the bayou, rivaling even the Meathead in pure strength. The documentation on it is a manifesto written by a hunter who calls himself Graham. This evil man is almost undoubtedly an unreliable narrator, but it's what we have. In the manifesto, Graham claims to be an individual that simply wishes to document all the horrors that he sees in the bayou, both the seen and the unseen. One of these stories seems to document the first appearance of a Brute. It opens with him placing bear traps at a supply drop, so right there you already know he's evil, and while he's doing that, he meets a young hunter, seemingly newly initiated, who noticed Graham's bear coat. He naively came to Graham in order to question him on how it was that he got that coat, as he wanted one for his own. Ordinarily, this would get any hunter shot on sight, as anyone who's traveled through the bayou would know. However, Graham has a far more sickening plan. He took the hunter to kill a nearby black bear and they began to flay it. Once flayed, however, Graham began to cloak the lone hunter in the skin as if to test it out as a coat, but at once began sewing, sealing the hunter within the bear skin. So yeah, like I said, evil. He literally writes about finding joy in his screams, and even used bear traps on him while he was inside the skin, taking glee with all his screams. This evil man was about to reap the consequences of his actions, however, as from within the bear skin, he began to hear different noises, the sound of flesh tearing, bones cracking, skin stretching, the sound of the corruption coming upon this freakish being he created, making his sick, twisted imagination come to life, and the first thing it did was attack him. Ultimately, Graham barely lived, mentally scarred by what he had just seen. In a way, this story shows a duality, as Graham says it's still out there, wandering, hunting, but so is he, left alive to wander the bayou and exude more cruelty upon innocent life. Ultimately, Graham proclaims that in the creation of the Brute, he saw the face of God, more likely, the sculptor. And so, with the story of that sick, twisted man aside, the Brute itself is, of course, an abomination to all that we know about natural biology. 2 human arms sticking out the back of its body, while one bear arm is attached to a standard shoulder. The second bear arm is deformed and unusable. This bear has no purpose in any kind of ecological system but to attack anyone it sees, biting, scratching, clawing, and even roaring, with its roar so loud it may injure the eardrums of any nearby hunters, causing them to bleed. This coincides with their ability to follow the scent of blood, and allows for an attack dynamic where the Brute screams so loud the nearby hunters bleed, and then it pinpoints their locations in order to finish them off. If the Brute were to be hunting for sustenance, the effectiveness of this strategy may vary. While a roar would too easily scare away any prey, if it were to cause them to bleed, assuming their sense of blood was exceptionally better than we may think, it could work in a way like a bloodhound, where all it has to do to effectively track its prey is to roar and make them bleed. However, obviously the Brute does not hunt for food, but rather for the continuance of death, simply being puppeted by the corruption. Overall, the Brute definitely fills the niche of the toughest units in the ranks of the monsters of the corruption. However, our final unit finds the niche of the most annoying monster. This unit is the Firebreather. I probably hate this monster the most. Not to say that it's poorly designed, in fact I actually like its design, it's more that this is really the only unit I always leave fighting with at least one missing bar. Whenever a hunter sees this thing, I would strongly advise them to avoid it if they plan on getting into any heated fights. The documentation that we have on the Firebreather is a collection of assorted papers detailing background information on the first Firebreather. It all starts in 1871, when a young, mentally unstable child called Timothy attends the Sacred Heart School for Troubled Boys. The boy exhibited many concerning behaviors, such as burning shapes onto himself with matches and using said matches to burn small birds to death. He also claimed to have witnessed the death of an individual called Father Renault. Troublingly, he described the smell as sweet and oily, like a pig being roasted for Christmas. Yeah, this implies that it was he himself that started the fire that led to the father's death, but the officials at the school chalked it up to a child's active imagination. I can only assume they did this because they didn't want to lose any capital from bad publicity because there was a student that they failed to teach. Years later, Timothy grows up and, as one would expect, doesn't get any better. One day on April 15, 1894, a police report states that Timothy, when questioned by a barkeep before burning the place to the ground, mentioned in part things about a quote-unquote dark anniversary related to his teacher's death, almost confirming that it was him who did it. After this, he reportedly lit a match and set the alcohol on the bar ablaze, which led to 4 confirmed deaths and possibly more. It seems that after this, Timothy went on something of an arsonist spree, burning things left and right until he made the decision to burn down something that would cost him his life. See, he burnt down the house of an elderly couple, tragically killing them in the process. They were described as a couple of generous, gracious, God-fearing folk who always had a helping hand to lend. They were truly great people, but they had a son who wasn't exactly that good of a person. In fact, the son of that elderly couple was the leader of a notoriously dangerous gang called the Turncoat Gang, a gang that had recently gotten a new member, Timothy, admitted into their ranks. Now you can imagine when the son of the elderly couple, only called Head Taker as his gang leader name, found out that his dear parents were brutally murdered, and by someone within his own ranks no less, he wasn't exactly willing to have a mere conversation with Timothy. Before Head Taker found Timothy, he wrote a confession detailing what he had done to Father Renault all those years ago and sent it in a bottle downstream. I'll spare you the details, but if you want to read it, here it is. When Head Taker finally got his hands on Timothy, he didn't just beat him to death, he lit Timothy on fire, giving him a taste of all the suffering that he had caused throughout the years. Timothy, not even putting up a fight, just sat there, trying to contain his screams to no avail. The smoke generated by the burning of his own flesh filled his lungs. Such an evil, mentally deranged man was a perfect medium for the corruption. Swiftly, the corruption took a hold of him as he began twisting, mutating into something else completely different. His chest lit up like the sun, his organs melted like magma, and what was formerly Timothy stood from the ashes. The first Firebreather was born. The Firebreather is the most recent monster to be found shambling its way through the bayou, scorching any hunter that may get too close in some twisted attempt to spread its own pain to others. As it's so new, particular information on it is yet to be documented. However, I'll share what we know. For one, the state of the Firebreather is in right now should make it a physical impossibility for it to function. With the Grunts, we could have guessed them similar to zombies of any other apocalypse, but the Firebreather's internal organs are literally melted, so we know for 100% sure that this is not a case where the corruption manipulates scientific systems like with the Grunt or Armored, but one like the Immolator or Hellhound, a being so corroded that the only explanation for their locomotion is that they are being directly puppeted by the forces of the corruption. Additionally, according to pages torn from a book called Tales from the Bayou, a Firebreather's purpose is said to be the spreading of agony through its breath of fire, in that there are more pieces of him now multiplying, transmitting more pain. It's this particular bit and a few others that I've glossed over that we will address in the afterword right now. Now, for the past few weeks, I have been nothing short of addicted to Hunt Showdown, especially its extremely interesting setting. While of course it is impossible to logically explain everything in the video game itself, there is actually a separate theory that recontextualizes all that I've spoken about up till now, which relates to the idea of the Sculptor. The Sculptor is essentially a deity worshipped by some factions in the universe of Hunt that is said to do something like copy and paste all these monsters where needed in order to protect its rifts and ultimately the bounty. The reason why I didn't elaborate on this at all in the video is simply because it doesn't really matter, I guess. I read all the lore entries on the standard monsters and the Sculptor is almost never mentioned at all, and the kind of duplication where versions of the same individual are placed around the maps is only mentioned a few times and never elaborated on. Even in YouTube lore videos, I could barely find any information on it at all. Any I did would oftentimes conflict with the information from the official Hunt lore entries. As a result of this, I just left anything about the Sculptor out to keep things simple, so please, before you go commenting this video is all wrong or something like that, instead just comment what you think is the truth. Overall, analyzing Hunt Showdown was definitely one of the most unique games I've researched thus far, with the majority of the documentation being on stories and occurrences rather than biology and the sciences, which was definitely a nice change of pace. And so, with all that being said, as always I hope this video has encouraged you to look at the games you play under a more detailed lens, and if you ever find something that you may find interesting, you can leave a comment below letting me know about it, and if you'd like the opportunity to know when I'll be uploading that video, or if you just want to support me in general, you can subscribe to my Patreon, and if you do, you'll get a video roadmap for all future videos that I may upload. If you want to support me in a way that does not involve a subscription, however, you can also purchase a product listed on this channel. However, you will be missing out on certain perks like early access and a shout out at the end of my videos. Speaking of, thank you to all my current Patreon subscribers, highlighting in particular my high tier subscriber, Meow. And with all that being said, thanks for watching, and goodbye.